This week our attention turns to the problem of battering, which is the other end of the discussion that we've been covering over the past several weeks. Of course, we've been looking at primarily the characteristics and effects upon victims, and as I've mentioned at different times during the semester, we can't really address the issue of family violence in any way to resolve it and do away with it without also dealing with and treating and working with batterers themselves. So this chapter hopefully will give you some information towards that end. Mostly, when you look at the problem of battering, of course, men are the primary injury-producing perpetrators in intimate partner violence. There is some discussion about the presence of female batterers in this discussion, and that is something that we will be addressing in the latter part of this particular week's lectures. But for the most part, when we talk about batterers, we are talking about men. Men kill more female intimates than the other way around, and women are the more likely victimized partners in any battering relationship. In terms of homicide and suicide events, some characteristics of batterers. Current and former intimate partners are the most likely to be involved in those events. This is the situation where one person kills his partner and then kills himself. So men are usually the ones that are the most likely to be involved in this, and it is current and former intimate partners. Women 18 to 54 years of age comprised 85% of the spousal victims of any battering relationship. And we also find that socioeconomic status, lower socioeconomic status, is a stronger predictor of intimate partner violence than is higher socioeconomic status. That is information that will be echoed later in this week's material as well. There are a number of ways to define intimate partner violence. And the government certainly has some involvement in this, given that it does fund a number of programs that treat this particular problem. And one of the things that is becoming more prevalent now in definitions of government definitions of this particular problem is that it begins to include the instigation of fear in the victim and some focus on partner control. In other words, you can't just look at physical problems or the physical assaults when defining intimate partner violence, but you also have to recognize the fact that sometimes there is an emotional violence that is a very significant contributor to this relationship. Partner control is an element of intimate partner violence, and so it's really not possible just to focus on physical assaults as far when we define what intimate partner violence involves. And in fact, a lot of people are thinking that aggression might be the more appropriate descriptor than violence. Some things about partner violence in terms of its patterns: it tends to intensify in degree and frequency over time. We have talked about the cycle of violence earlier, that is the tension building, battering, and honeymoon phases that are evident in adult violent relationships, although it is interesting that the text here talks about the fact that there really hasn't been a lot of research that substantiates this cycle. Nonetheless, this is a cycle that is very widely accepted in the field and is sort of the basis for much of the interventions that we provide. So research might actually show us that there's some better ways of understanding it someday and might help us to be more effective in treating this problem. But at the present time, that is the sort of the state of the art in understanding domestic violence. And it's very, very possible that even as one form of abuse stops, physical abuse, sexual abuse, whatever it is, another one might start without effective intervention. Homicide is certainly the most feared outcome of intimate partner violence, but it is the least likely outcome according to most of the studies. So while there's a lot of concern for that, it doesn't occur that frequently. And yet there's a 2008 study by the Department of Justice which addressed almost 700 spousal murders, and you see there that while 119 husbands were killed by wives, 577 women were killed by their husbands. And these studies also suggest that men who are violent with their partners are more likely to have an elevated risk of suicide than men who are not involved in violent relationships. The most frequent, sexual assault is a frequently occurring form of abuse that occurs in violent marital relationships. Somewhere between 8 and 14% of women who have ever been married or who have ever lived with a male partner report having been raped by their partner at one time or another. And 87% of battered wives report that the husbands tell them or believe that sex is their right because they're married, even if the wife isn't interested in sex at the time. The most common form of psychological or other partner abuse is the psychological and emotional abuse. And you see here the authors talk about 7 major types of psychological abuse, a wide variety of kinds of behaviors that men will participate in controlling their partners, including isolation, economic abuse, and really this probably means denying the wife any money of her own or taking her money so that she doesn't have the freedom that money might bring to her. Degradation, rigid sex role expectations, withholding emotional responsiveness, psychological destabilizing, monopolizing relationships, all those kinds of things are forms of psychological abuse. And typical of male batterers are controlling behaviors that include things such as even controlling things like what she reads so that she doesn't get too much information, I suppose. Not allowing her to work, not letting her to use the phone, not permitting her to go to school or take classes. If she is out and about or away from the home, or if she's back in the home, dropping in and checking on her persistently, controlling her money, all those kinds of things where she really has no freedom whatsoever. Coercive control should be considered to be a central feature of male partner interpersonal violence. And this may be connected to some theories that violent men either feel very powerless, and so they engage in violence in order to compensate for the feelings of powerlessness they have in their lives, or the need to dominate for one reason or another based upon another number of psychological characteristics. But in terms of non-lethal assault estimates, females experience 5 times as many incidents of non-fatal violence as do males. And again, women are victims in 85% of the cases. That's a statistic that I think we bumped into earlier. So you see that this is clearly something much more characteristic with female victims. But in our culture, there are a lot of attitudes that support or set the stage, let's say, for domestic violence. As the textbook says, there's a lot of approval of male-to-female violence. And because of that, batterers have a tendency sometimes to blame their aggression on really everything, but not take responsibility for it for themselves. So oftentimes you'll hear batterers explaining external factors like the stress in their lives, or the fact that they were drinking that day, or using some drugs, or that they were jealous about something their partner did, really blaming the victim, anything but accepting responsibility themselves. And again, unhappily married men who are violent always tend to blame their wives. There was a study that the textbook talks about the violent couple, and this really addresses the question of female perpetrated violence. And it says that abuse in a relationship in these violent couples can be unidirectional or bidirectional. And this is really, again, part of that big debate in the field, is even when women are involved in violent behaviors towards men, sometimes it is started by the male. But in any event, this particular study showed that mutual violence was possibly evident or possibly involved in about 35% of the couples, the violent couples that were studied. That 54% of those incidences of violence had the males as the primary perpetrators, and only 11% had females as the primary perpetrators. But even with that, though, it's important to keep in mind that the interpersonal violence by females is not equal in severity, as generally speaking, as it is when a male initiates it, and more about that later. There is some thought that most likely what happens is that there is a situation that occurs, and then individual traits of the batterer that interact with that situation that lead to the violent episode. And so this would explain a little bit how sometimes, individuals with certain traits might not ever be involved in battering relationships, or why certain things can happen in one couple and they get along fine and other couples don't. It is the combination of those traits and the situation leading to violence. And some of the characteristics that are pretty common with men who batter include a tendency to deny and minimize harm to the victim, either insisting to begin with that there was no harm, that whatever the batterer did really didn't affect the victim, or if it did, it was really not very serious. Some batterers are thought to have what's called a trait anger. That is, that they just have an angry personality that they carry with them all the time. And there's also some thoughts that intermittent explosive disorder, which is actually a psychological disorder, also has a part to play in some of these situations. Sometimes batterers are depressed, even to clinical levels. They often suffer from low self-esteem, carrying problems of shame and guilt and humiliation from their childhood that lead to anxious attachment issues in their adult relationships. And of course, that anxiety in relationships is one of the things that kind of prompts them to be very controlling and can lead to some violence. And then just a general lack of awareness. Sometimes the text talks about even a sort of an automaticity to violent behaviors, where there are certain cues in the environment that might cause them to misinterpret events, and almost the hitting is almost automatic in nature. Batterers tend to lack empathy. And although this isn't confirmed through research, this is also something that's really very evident to those of us that work with this population. It's really very difficult for batterers to reach out. For the most part, again, we're talking in generalities, but it's difficult for them to reach out beyond themselves to really understand what's going on with their victims. Oftentimes there have been attachment difficulties from childhood. And they are very emotionally dependent, much more so than nonviolent male perpetrators, nonviolent male partners are. And jealousy is also a feature that is often intertwined with perpetrators' violence. And there's a number of different reasons why this jealousy might be prompted. And for instance, the notion of this evolutionary notion of mate guarding, that is that men have to that they own their wives and have to control them and protect them and keep them from possible other suitors and things like this. This kind of gets back into some of those theories that we might have about hard wiring of these behaviors in men. Patriarchy certainly tends to doom females to through traditional socialization to the role of being submissive and to being controlled. That traditional socialization, gender socialization, does that. And also lower marital satisfaction is another thing that tends to predict violence. Now, that's not the same thing as marital happiness. Marital satisfaction is a different feature, but lower marital satisfaction tends to predict violence. Another source that I wanted to kind of bring into this discussion was a text that I had referred to earlier in the semester by Bancroft and Silverman called "The Batterer as Parent," and this is a book that was out probably 7 or 8 years ago. It's still widely read, and in this they identify certain characteristics of batterers that I just wanted to share with you. Now, a lot of this is similar to what the text tells us. There are a few other things that are quite different, but they look, first of all, among characteristics of batterers, both at behavioral and attitudinal characteristics, and they say the dominant behavioral characteristic of a batterer is control. That is something that they have to keep control of people around them. This may go beyond the partner to include their children and a number of different things around them. Attitudinally speaking, batterers often experience feelings of entitlement also, that they have a right to be on top of things, that they have a right to be catered to, that they have a right to have their needs and wishes met. There is a self-centeredness where this kind of gets into this back to this entitlement, where they really expect the family life to center on the batterer himself, and this really includes and can play itself out in any one of or all of physical, emotional, or sexual realms, and also can include children that he may expect his children to please him and to really kind of orient their behaviors around keeping him happy. There is a sense of superiority, certainly a sense of possessiveness that they own the other members of their family and should be able to control them. Confusion of love and abuse. The batterers will sometimes tell you that their abuse happens because they just have such an intense love for their victim, and he couldn't really help himself when he saw her talking to another male or when he thought she might be leaving. And the problem is, oftentimes we kind of buy into this and we accept this in treatment, and this is something that we need to be very cautious about. Batterers tend to be manipulative, and this through their violent episodes and then interspersed with episodes where they're kindly and giving and rewarding, and then another violent episode. And so as victims begin to feel as though they want to leave the relationship, the batterers can really kind of turn on the charm and convince the victims that the violence was the exception, not the rule. Oftentimes, blame is shifted to the partner or others, as we mentioned earlier, in externalizing responsibility. Batterers deny and minimize the seriousness of their behavior as well. And one other thing that's very important here as we close this section of this week's lecture, and this is about the serial nature of battering, and this is why simply getting the victim and the children to leave the batterer isn't going to solve the problem. And it may, and may is it's a possibility. It isn't very definitely, but it may help the family to get away from him. He may come after them or chase them later, may stalk them, or she may go back to him. So it doesn't mean that when the woman leaves the batterer that the problem is solved by any means. But even if she does stay away, batterers tend to seek out other women who will submit to the same kind of behaviors, and so that whole dynamic of a battering relationship begins again. And so the victim leaving the relationship will not cure this problem. The problem needs to be addressed both through getting the victim away from the batterer, but also treating the batterer and strengthening the victim. And so that's it for chapter 1, or rather part 1 of this particular chapter. And go ahead and click on the next one, and we'll continue this discussion.